Okay, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to talk about what evolution actually says. So, Darwin is the one that comes up with this theory of evolution. How does it work? What is he proposing? Let's find out. All right, so Charles Darwin was born in the 1800s. He worked as what's called a ship's naturalist on a very famous ship called the HMS Beagle. And you can see from the diagram here, he basically traveled around the world. And it was his job to collect species and to name them and to draw pictures of them. And so he collected birds and plants and all kinds of different animals from all over the world. And as he was traveling, he started, and he visited a famous place called the Galapagos Islands. It's famous now for Darwin having visited there. And as he travels around the world, he notices how some species look very similar to species he's seen in other places, but how they're uniquely adapted to their particular environment. And he starts coming up with this idea of evolution. And finally, in 1859, many years after he returned from his voyage, he wrote the very famous book called On the Origin of Species. And it's a book that you can still pick up at Barnes & Noble or some bookstore today. However, it's fairly difficult reading in terms of the English, is just a little bit old style English, but you can still read that book today. So what is it that he figured out? What is it that was his sort of unique idea? And it's this idea that's called descent with modification. So his quote here is, "Newer forms appearing in the fossil record are actually the modified descendants of older species." So rather than everybody being separate, they're all related, including human beings. And that was maybe a little bit controversial at the time, was the idea that that humans are related to animals and that we may have evolved from animals. So that's his idea. So then what really made Darwin's ideas genius, there were other scientists who were coming up with these exact same ideas. He wasn't the only one. He was the first one to publish his ideas, and that's why we say Darwin is the one that comes up with this, and it's Darwin's theory of evolution. But really his genius was in how evolution is happening. And there are four kind of steps. If I'm going to break it down and make it as simple as possible, we're going to break it into four steps. And it's not that there's sequential steps, but just four things that have to happen in order for evolution to occur. So the first one is Darwin's idea of overproduction. He stated that more offspring are being produced than can survive. I want you to think, like right now, it's summertime when I'm making this video, and there are cottonwood seeds, fluff, all over. It looks like it's snowing outside. Each one of those is a cottonwood tree baby. Well, only one out of, millions of them are actually going to survive into adulthood to make more cottonwood trees. So that's an example of overproduction. In this photograph of all these little ducklings, very few of these ducklings actually will survive into adulthood. It's kind of shocking. And so the idea here is that offspring are always competing for limited resources, and the environment is constantly changing. So there's new food sources or new predators or new climates or new diseases. And so being a baby is really difficult, and lots of babies die. And only the babies that are ideally suited for the surrounding and their parents are the ones that survive. So then number two is genetic variation. Darwin didn't know what DNA was, but he knew that the babies were born slightly different. So in the photograph here, all of these babies, one baby is a little bit taller. One baby maybe has a longer beak or a shorter beak. One baby's wings maybe are longer. One baby maybe has a better immune system. And that's how they're born. Now we know today that that's their DNA, that they have variations in their DNA. And anytime that a baby has a useful variation, a variation that helps them survive, if all these babies are infected with a disease, the one who has the strongest immune system, that's going to be an adaptation, a useful variation. Or if they're all chased by a new predator, and the one that can run the fastest, or the one whose feathers develop at the youngest age and it's able to actually flap away from the predator, that's a useful variation. It's caused by a mutation in the DNA. Darwin didn't know that. He just knew that they were born with variation. variations. And the ones that had useful variations, he referred to those useful variations as adaptations. Now, to be clear, mutations are usually bad. Mutations are changes in our DNA, and it can be, I'm showing you some letters of DNA. Notice it says cat, 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 and then we're showing you different mutations that can happen in animals. Most of the time, mutations are things that are harmful. These are humans in this example here, where they have mutations in hands or feet. Here's a frog that has a mutation. It's an extra set of legs. Is that good? Not at all. Most mutations are either harmful or don't affect the organism at all. Many mutations don't affect us at all, and we don't even realize we have them. However, the idea is that on occasion, get my face out of the way, on occasion, there are mutations that are advantageous, like giving us a stronger immune system or making us a little taller or making us mature earlier or whatever it is that that particular organism needs. Organisms with these helpful mutations are then healthier and, very important, better able to reproduce and create surviving offspring. So step number 3 of Darwin's ideas here is called the struggle to survive. Some of you may have heard of it as survival of the fittest. That's a little misleading, but we'll go with struggle to survive. So all of these babies that are being born, and remember, they're all a little bit different, they have to compete for resources. Finally, we have step number 4, unequal reproduction. Those with the best adaptations are more likely to survive and then reproduce. And their babies, their offspring, are likely to have the same genetic traits that they were born with. So if you have a whole bunch of baby ducklings and one of them has a better immune system and it survives and the others die because they came down with a disease they couldn't fight off, then the baby that survived gets to reproduce and it gets to pass that strong immune system on to its offspring. Offspring are genetically similar to their parents. Over time, all of these, after generation after generation after generation, these variations start to add up. And eventually, if you have so many variations, so many adaptations, the differences are so great that we actually say, hey, now there's a new species. It took maybe 100 generations. I just made that number up. But now we have a new species. And just really quickly, the definition of species, 2 animals are a different species if they can't successfully mate and produce offspring that will survive. So that's really the difference between a species. So for example, lions and tigers, they're considered different species. They can mate and they can produce babies that survive. The problem is that they are located in different areas of the world, so they don't mate. So tigers are in Asia and lions are in Africa. So those are different species. So that's just an example of what species are. And let me back up and just go over this picture really quickly. So imagine we have these beetles. This is just an example. Imagine we have these beetles and they come in 2 varieties. They come in a brown variety and they come in a green variety. And that color is determined by their DNA. And in this example, they happen to live on the bark of a brownish tree. Well, being green in this example is a disadvantage, and being brown is that advantageous trait, that adaptation, because they're camouflaged. And so the predators are going to eat the green beetles. And so over time, we're going to see this population shift away from being like 50-50 green and brown to primarily brown. Now, ideally, you would still have those green individuals on occasion in this population. We don't want that variation to go away. We don't want these bugs to become clones, because at some point in the future, let's say the climate changes and this where these trees are growing now becomes a rainforest, and the trees are now covered with mosses and lichens and the bark looks green. Well, now which bug is going to have the advantage? So now if the rainforest has in fact arrived, the green beetles might be at an advantage, and then we'll see that population shift the other direction to more green beetles and fewer brown beetles. So diversity is good. We don't want to get rid of our diversity. It's just that having that diversity allows a species to flex when the climate changes or when there's a change in the environment. All right, so the secret to evolution: a species does not evolve unless there's a selective pressure, unless there's a reason for it to change. So, for example, if there's no disease, then the duckling's immune system, generation after generation after generation after generation, isn't going to change. New genes will come and go. It doesn't matter that one has a stronger immune system and one has a weaker immune system if there's not a disease that they need the strong immune system for it. So nothing's going to change until something happens, and we call that a selective pressure. So here are examples of selective pressures: new predators. You have to be faster to escape now than your offspring or your siblings or other competitors. New food sources. You have to be able to get a food. You have to have the right size beak in order to eat a particular new food. There's a new climate. The tropical rainforest arrives. There's a new disease, etc. Those are examples of selective pressures. If there are no already successful individuals, meaning individuals who already have the good immune system, or who already have the right sized beak for getting that food, or who already can escape from the predator, if they're not already present in the population, if that population does not have some diversity, then the species may go extinct because the predators will eat them all or the disease will kill them all. So diversity is important. And the reality is that many, in fact, the vast majority of species that have arisen on this planet have in fact gone extinct because they couldn't adapt to changes in time before they died, before their entire population passed away. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is it. That gives you the idea of Darwin's theory of evolution. Next, we're going to talk about evidence for evolution.